Well, aren't you a lucky one getting to ride in the big leagues today? That's the first thing she said to him. Not, "Welcome aboard, sir." Not, "Can I take your coat?" But a sentence dripping with so much condescending poison it could curdle milk. She saw a black man in a designer tracksuit boarding a $75 million private jet, and her mind snapped to a conclusion. She thought he was a rapper, an athlete, a lottery winner, someone who didn't belong. She had no idea she was speaking to Julian Vance, the CEO, who had just bought the entire charter company. She had no idea that in 10 minutes, after a single shocking act of violence, he wouldn't just fire her. He would fire his entire executive team right there at 40,000 feet. This isn't just a story about racism. It's a story about power silence and the kind of karma that doesn't just knock on your door, it demolishes your entire house. The air at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey had a unique scent, a crisp blend of jet fuel, money, and ambition. It was the smell of power taking flight. On the tarmac, gleaming under the late morning sun, sat a Gulfstream G700 serial number, NA700 JV. It was a spear of pearlescent white and obsidian black, a $75 million testament to engineering and wealth. To Brenda Jenkins, it was just her office. For 12 years, Brenda had been a corporate flight attendant for Sterling Sky Charters. She considered herself the gatekeeper of this airborne world. She knew the difference between new money and old who drank Macallan 25 and who was happy with Glenlivet 12. She prided herself on an almost psychic ability to read her passengers. Today her psychic sense was buzzing with disapproval. 4 passengers were walking across the tarmac. The first 3 were exactly what she expected. A man in an impeccably tailored Italian suit, Marcus Thorne, the COO, radiating a nervous energy. A woman in a severe but expensive pantsuit, Eleanor Finch, the CFO, clutching a leather-bound portfolio like a shield. A younger man in trendy glasses and a blazer that was trying too hard, David Chen. The CTO eyes already glued to his phone. Standard. Predictable. But it was the 4th man, the one leading them, who made Brenda's lips purse into a thin, judgmental line. He was tall and athletic, dressed not in a suit, but in a bespoke Xenia tracksuit of deep charcoal grey. On his feet were pristine, limited-edition sneakers that probably cost more than her rent. He moved with a liquid grace, an unbothered confidence that to Brenda looked like arrogance. This was Julian Vance, the CEO of Vance Innovations, a tech behemoth that had, just in a move that shocked the industry, acquired a portfolio of luxury service companies. A portfolio that included Sterling Sky Charters. None of them, not even his own team, knew the deal was finalized. He was, for all intents and purposes, their new invisible boss. This flight was meant to be a final discreet assessment of the charter service's top-tier experience before the public announcement. A final test. As Julian stepped onto the airstairs, Brenda blocked the entrance to the cabin, her smile as brittle as spun sugar. She looked past him, addressing Marcus Thorne. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Thorne. The cabin is prepared for you." Then she turned her gaze to Julian, her eyes doing a slow, insulting crawl from his expensive sneakers up to his calm face. The smile tightened. Well, she said, her voice laced with a saccharine condescension, "Aren't you a lucky one getting to ride in the big leagues today?" A dead silence fell on the airstairs. The hum of the auxiliary power unit seemed to amplify the insult. Marcus Thorne's face went pale. Eleanor Finch's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she stared fixedly at the ground. David Chen, for his part, finally looked up from his phone, a confused frown on his face. Julian Vance didn't react. Not outwardly. His expression remained placid, almost serene. He held Brenda's gaze for a long moment, a flicker of something ancient and knowing in his eyes. He had faced this his whole life, the surprise, the condescension, the assumption that his success was an anomaly, a fluke, a gift bestowed upon him by others. "I am very lucky," Julian said, his voice, a smooth, low baritone that carried no hint of anger. "We all are. It's a beautiful day to fly." He stepped past her into the cabin, the scent of rich leather and polished wood enveloping him. The insult hung in the air undetonated. Brenda, misinterpreting his calm as weakness, felt a surge of validation. She had him pegged. He was just part of the entourage, some guest along for the ride. She was in charge here. Julian took a seat in one of the plush cream leather armchairs. His team followed, settling in with a palpable awkwardness. Marcus cleared his throat. "Brenda, this is our CEO, Mr. Julian Vance." Brenda's smile didn't falter. It just changed its flavor from condescension to dismissiveness. "Of course. Welcome aboard, Mr. Vance." The Mr. Vance was an over-enunciated correction, an implicit apology for her own team's failure to introduce him properly in her mind. As she began the safety briefing, Julian watched his team. He saw Marcus's fidgeting his desire to smooth things over to appease the flight attendant, rather than correct her. He saw Eleanor's deliberate avoidance, her focus on her papers, her silent retreat from the conflict. He saw David already lost in his laptop, treating the entire interaction as background noise. He wasn't angry at Brenda. He'd met 1,000 Brendas. He was a force of nature she couldn't comprehend, a mountain she mistook for a molehill. No, he wasn't angry at her. He was disappointed. He was watching the people he paid to be his generals, his strategists, his inner circle, and seeing them fail the simplest test of all, the test of character. The engines of the Gulf Stream spooled up with a deep, powerful hum. The jet taxied onto the runway, a predator gathering its strength. Inside the gilded cage of the cabin, a storm was gathering, and only one man knew it was about to break. The flight to Los Angeles was scheduled to take 5 hours. Julian had a feeling it wouldn't take nearly that long for things to come to a head. Once the jet reached its cruising altitude of 41,000 feet, Brenda Jenkins began her service. It was a performance she had perfected over years, a ballet of pouring champagne and presenting canapes. But today, her performance was designed to subtly underline a narrative she had already constructed in her head. She approached Marcus first. "Mr. Thorne, a glass of Dom Perignon, 2012. She offered her voice, warm and deferential. "Yes, please, Brenda." "Thank you," he said, relieved at the return to normalcy. She served Eleanor and David with the same professional courtesy. When she got to Julian, the warmth vanished, replaced by a chilly efficiency. "And for you?" she asked, not using his name. "I'd prefer water, please." Still, with a slice of lime, Julian requested his eyes on the clouds outside his window. Brenda paused. "We have a wonderful selection of beverages on board. Champagne, premium spirits, fresh squeezed juices." "Still water." With lime, Julian repeated his tone, unchanged. It was polite, but it was not a negotiation. Brenda's smile was a taut slash of red lipstick. "Of course." She returned a few minutes later and placed a glass of water on the small table beside him. There was no lime. It was a small omission, a tiny act of passive aggression, so deniable it was perfect. Julian looked at the glass, then up at her. He didn't say a word. He simply let the silence ask the question for him. "We seem to be out of limes," she said with a dismissive shrug. "So sorry." She then turned her attention back to Marcus, laughing at a weak joke he made about the market. Julian took a slow sip of the plain water. He watched his team. Marcus was now actively trying to win Brenda's favor, complimenting the service, the smoothness of the flight, the quality of the champagne. He was trying to compensate for the initial awkwardness, for his boss's unconventional appearance, and simple drink order. Eleanor kept her head down her pen, scratching furiously across a notepad, creating a fortress of work around herself. David had his noise-cancelling headphones on, coding on his laptop, completely sealed off from the social dynamics playing out inches away from him. An hour into the flight lunch was served. The menu was exquisite pan-seared scallops with a saffron risotto or a filet mignon with truffle reduction. Brenda described the dishes in lavish detail to Marcus and Eleanor. When she turned to Julian, her tone flattened. "Scallops or beef?" "The scallops sound excellent, thank you," Julian said. She returned from the galley with 3 beautifully plated meals. She served Marcus his steak, Eleanor her scallops, and David, after a tap on the shoulder, his steak. Then she stood before Julian, her expression a mask of professional regret. "I am so terribly sorry," she said, the insincerity thick in her voice. "There seems to have been a mix-up with the catering order. We only have 2 servings of the scallops. Would the beef be acceptable?" It was another power play. She was making him the difficult one, the one whose preferences couldn't be met, reinforcing his status as the outsider. Before Julian could respond, Marcus jumped in. "Oh, that's no problem at all, Mr. Vance. I'm sure the beef is fantastic. Sterling's catering is always top-notch." He was practically begging his boss to be agreeable to not make a fuss. Julian looked at Marcus, a profound disappointment settling in his chest. Marcus wasn't just placating the flight attendant. He was managing his own discomfort by trying to manage his boss. He was siding with the aggressor to maintain a fragile, superficial peace. "The beef will be fine," Julian said quietly. He wasn't going to argue about food. The meal was irrelevant. The behavior was everything. Brenda served him the steak with a triumphant little smile and retreated to the galley. Julian ate in silence, the rich food tasting like ash in his mouth. He wasn't evaluating the catering anymore. He was evaluating his leadership team. He had built Vance Innovations from a startup in a garage to a global powerhouse by surrounding himself with the sharpest minds. He thought he had chosen lions, but here in this pressurized cabin, they were acting like mice, scurrying away from the slightest confrontation. He had always believed that a person's true character isn't revealed when they face a king, but when they face a bully on behalf of someone else. And his team was failing. Their silence wasn't neutral. It was an endorsement of Brenda's behavior. Their refusal to acknowledge the subtle, persistent disrespect being shown to their leader, to a black man in a space where she clearly felt he didn't belong, was a betrayal far deeper than any business disagreement. He finished his meal and pushed the plate away. He looked out the window at the endless expanse of blue and white. The irony was crushing. He was the master of this domain, the owner of the very metal and machinery carrying them through the sky. He held the careers of everyone on board, including his own team, in the palm of his hand. Yet to the flight attendant, he was just an inconvenience, and to his team, he was a problem to be managed. He made a decision. It was cold hard and absolute. The acquisition of Sterling Sky Charters was no longer just a business deal. It was now a cleanup operation, and it was going to start sooner than anyone thought. He reached for his satellite phone. The atmosphere in the cabin had grown thick with unspoken tension. Julian had been on his satellite phone for a few minutes, his voice too low to be overheard, but the intensity of the call was evident in his posture. He was speaking to Robert Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Sky Charters. "No, Robert, I don't think you understand the situation," Julian said, his voice a blade of ice. "Your premier service is being demonstrated right now, and I am unimpressed, deeply unimpressed." Brenda, who had been clearing the last of the lunch plates, overheard the name Robert Sterling. Her boss. Her body went rigid. Who was this man to be speaking to Mr. Sterling with such authority? Her mind raced, but the conclusion it landed on was still leagues away from the truth. She assumed he was an important client, making a complaint, trying to get a discount or a freebie. It was an audacious move, and it infuriated her. It was a challenge to her domain. Julian ended the call and placed the phone on the table. He looked directly at Brenda, his face an unreadable mask. "Brenda," he said, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable weight of command. "Your service today has been unprofessional. Your comments have been inappropriate. I want you to remain in the galley for the rest of this flight and have the co-pilot handle any cabin needs. Is that clear?" It was a direct order. Not a request. Not a suggestion. The color drained from Brenda's face, then rushed back in a hot, mottled flush of fury. Her entire sense of self, her authority in this cabin, her 12 years of perceived superiority, were being challenged by the man she had dismissed from the moment he stepped on board. All her microaggressions, her slights about the water and the scallops, had been leading to this. He had called her out. "Excuse me," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "You have no right to tell me how to do my job. I am the lead flight attendant on this aircraft. I answer to Captain Miller and Mr. Sterling, not to you." The "you" was loaded with a dozen insults. Marcus Thorne looked like he was about to have a heart attack. "Mr. Vance, Brenda." "Please," he stammered, making vague, placating gestures with his hands. "Let's all just calm down. It's been a long flight." "Stay out of this, Marcus Julian," said, his eyes never leaving Brenda's. That was it. The final straw for Brenda. To be publicly reprimanded, to have her authority usurped, and then to have him use the first name of the man she had been fawning over, it was too much. Her carefully constructed professional veneer shattered, revealing the raw, ugly prejudice beneath. "Who do you think you are?" she snarled, stepping closer, her body vibrating with indignation. "You walk on here in your flashy little outfit, thinking you own the world. Some people have to work for a living. Some of us belong here. You got lucky on a record deal or a basketball court, and you think that gives you the right to talk down to me." Every stereotype, every bitter assumption came pouring out. Eleanor Finch physically recoiled in her seat, pressing herself against the window, as if to escape the ugliness. David finally pulled off his headphones, his face a canvas of pure shock. Marcus was frozen, his mouth agape. Julian Vance slowly rose from his seat. He was a good 6 inches taller than her, and the sheer force of his presence seemed to suck the air from the cabin. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You are wrong about everything," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "About who I am, about where I belong, and about who is in charge on this aircraft. Now go to the galley." And then it happened. In a moment of pure, unadulterated rage, of white-hot entitlement, meeting an immovable object, Brenda's training, her professionalism, her sanity all evaporated. She swung, her hand a flash of pale skin and red-painted nails cracked across Julian's face. The sound of the slap was sharp and obscene in the quiet cabin. It was louder than the engines, louder than the panicked gasps from Eleanor and David. For a heartbeat, there was absolute ringing silence. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply stood there, the red mark of her hand blooming on his cheek. The serene calm in his eyes was gone, replaced by something as cold and vast as the stratosphere outside. Brenda stared at her own hand, then at his face, a flicker of horror dawning in her eyes. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. She had assaulted a passenger on a private jet. In mid-air, Marcus Thorne finally found his voice, a pathetic squeak. "Oh my God, Brenda, what did you do?" But Julian wasn't looking at Brenda anymore. His gaze swept over his team. He saw their shock, their horror, their fear, but he also saw what had come before it, their silent complicity, their cowardly inaction. They had watched the small fires of disrespect and done nothing, and now the whole forest was ablaze. They had allowed the situation to escalate to this. He turned his back on Brenda, dismissing her completely as if she had ceased to exist. He walked to the front of the cabin and picked up the intercom phone to the cockpit. He pressed the button. "Captain Miller, this is Julian Vance." The captain's voice came back, calm and professional. "Yes, Mr. Vance? Is there a problem?" "Yes," Julian said, his voice echoing through the silent cabin. "We have a problem, a big one. Divert this aircraft to the nearest suitable airport immediately. And I mean immediately. Divert, sir, our flight plan is filed for Van Nuys." Captain Miller's voice crackled back, laced with confusion. "We'd need to declare an in-flight emergency." "What is the nature of the situation?" Julian's gaze was fixed on his team. Marcus was sweating profusely, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. Eleanor looked like she was about to be physically ill. David was staring wide-eyed between Julian and the still-frozen Brenda. "The nature of the situation," Captain Julian said into the intercom, his voice resonating with cold authority, "is that a member of your crew has just physically assaulted me. And I am the new owner of this airline. So yes, I would classify that as an emergency. Find the nearest runway. Land this plane." A stunned silence came from the cockpit. The words "new owner of this airline" detonated in the cabin with the force of a bomb. Brenda Jenkins swayed on her feet, her face ashen. The world tilted on its axis. The man she had insulted, belittled and just slapped, was not a guest. He wasn't an entourage member. He was her boss's boss's boss. He owned the plane, the company, her job, her entire future. The enormity of her miscalculation was so vast it was incomprehensible. Marcus Thorne's jaw unhinged. He looked at Julian, truly seeing him for the first time, not as his quirky tracksuit-wearing CEO, but as a titan of industry who had just been assaulted in front of them. A titan whose team had done nothing. "Mr. Vance? Julian? We—" Marcus stammered, his sycophantic brain short-circuiting. Julian ignored him. He hung up the intercom and turned to face his three executives. The red mark on his cheek was a stark accusation. 10 minutes ago, he began, his voice low and cutting. "I was on the phone with Robert Sterling, finalizing the last details of an acquisition that we have been working on for 6 months. As of 9 a.m. this morning, Vance Innovations is the 100% owner of Sterling Sky Charters. This jet, this crew, this entire operation is mine." He let that sink in. The silence was absolute, save for the hum of the engines that were now presumably changing course. "I arranged this flight for a specific reason," he continued, his eyes locking onto Marcus. "I wanted to see the best-in-class service for myself. But I also wanted to see my leadership team in action outside the boardroom. I wanted to see how you handle pressure, how you react to the unexpected." He paused, his gaze shifting to Eleanor, who shrank under his stare. "I believe character is not what you show me in a quarterly review. It's what you do when you think no one who matters is watching, or when you see an injustice, big or small, and have to decide whether to speak up or stay silent." His voice was devoid of heat now. It was the voice of a surgeon making a precise, final incision. "From the moment we stepped on this plane, I was targeted. Subtly at first, then overtly. It was textbook, the dismissive tone, the mistakes with the water, the food, the racist stereotypes. You all saw it." He pointed a finger at Marcus. You didn't just stay silent. You actively tried to appease her. You laughed at her jokes. You tried to manage me, to get me to conform to her bigotry to make your flight more comfortable. You chose her side." He then turned to Eleanor. "And you? You saw it all. I saw the discomfort in your eyes. You knew it was wrong. But you buried your head in your work. You built a wall of spreadsheets and hoped it would go away. Your silence was a vote. You voted for inaction. You voted for this to continue." Finally, he looked at David, who now looked terrified. "And you? You put on your headphones. You coded. You tuned out the entire world. In your own bubble, while your team leader, your CEO, was being systematically disrespected right next to you, you chose ignorance." He took a deep breath. "I don't need a COO who lacks a spine. I don't need a CFO who lacks moral courage. And I don't need a CTO who is deaf and blind to the world around him. I need warriors. I need leaders. You are not it." He looked at the three of them, their multi-million-dollar careers evaporating before their eyes at 40,000 feet. "Marcus Eleanor David, your employment with Vance Innovations is terminated, effective immediately." The words hung in the air, brutal and final. It wasn't just about the slap. The slap was merely the logical conclusion of the cowardice they had displayed. He wasn't firing them out of anger. He was firing them because he had subjected his leadership team to a stress test they had catastrophically failed. Their silence, their complicity had allowed the situation to escalate to physical violence. In his world, that was an unforgivable failure of leadership. The intercom crackled again. "Mr. Vance, this is Captain Miller. We've been cleared for an emergency landing at Salt Lake City International. We'll be on the ground in approximately 20 minutes. "Thank you," Captain Julian said. He then looked past his now former team at the woman who had started it all. Brenda Jenkins was sobbing quietly, tears carving paths through her makeup. She was a ghost already, a footnote in a much larger story of corporate failure. Firing her was a certainty, a mere administrative task. The real purge had already happened. For the next 20 minutes, no one spoke. It was a descent in every sense of the word, the G700 gliding smoothly toward the ground, while the lives of 4 people in its cabin fell apart in a violent, silent freefall. The Gulf Stream touched down on the runway at Salt Lake City International with a gentle bump, a stark contrast to the turbulent emotions inside. Before the jet had even taxied to the private terminal, flashing blue and red lights could be seen approaching across the tarmac. Julian had not called the police, but Captain Miller, following FAA protocol for an in-flight assault and an unscheduled landing under duress, most certainly had. As the air stairs lowered, 2 uniformed airport police officers boarded. Captain Miller was right behind them, his face grim. He nodded respectfully to Julian, the red mark on his cheek still visible, before gesturing towards a now catatonic Brenda Jenkins. "That's her," the captain said simply. Brenda didn't protest, as the officers calmly informed her she was being detained for questioning regarding an alleged assault. She was escorted down the stairs in a daze, her high-flying career ending on a sun-bleached Utah tarmac in handcuffs. The last thing she saw as they led her away was Julian Vance, standing at the top of the stairs watching her departure with an impassive expression. Next to D-Plane were Marcus Eleanor and David. They looked like survivors of a wreck, their expensive clothes seeming like costumes on their defeated frames. They shuffled down the stairs into a world where they were no longer a COO, CFO, and CTO of a tech giant. They were just 3 unemployed people in Salt Lake City, with no return flight. A black car, prearranged by Julian during his descent, was waiting for them. It would take them to a hotel. Their corporate cards were already deactivated. Their laptops and phones would be wiped remotely within the hour. The severance Julian had decided would be the legal minimum. Nothing more. Julian remained on the plane with Captain Miller. Mr. Vance, the captain, said, his voice heavy with professionalism. "On behalf of the crew, I am profoundly sorry for what happened on this flight. Her behavior was inexcusable and is not representative of Sterling Sky Charters." "It was Sterling Sky Charters," Captain Julian corrected him gently. "And you're right, it was inexcusable. Which is why, as of this morning, things are going to change. Drastically. The hard karma for Brenda Jenkins began almost immediately. She was fired, of course. Robert Sterling, desperate to placate his new boss, terminated her via email before her police questioning was even finished. But that was just the beginning. The story of the slap at 40,000 feet ripped through the incredibly small insular world of corporate aviation. Pilots, flight attendants, dispatchers, and charter brokers, they all talked. The story became a cautionary tale. Brenda wasn't just fired, she was blacklisted. Her name became synonymous with the ultimate professional sin. She applied to other charter companies, NetJets, FlexJet, VistaJet. Her resume was impressive, 12 years of top-tier experience. But the moment her name was run, doors slammed shut. One HR manager in Ohio was brutally honest over the phone. "Are you Brenda Jenkins?" "The one from the Sterling G700 incident?" the woman asked. There were extenuating circumstances. Brenda began, her voice pleading. "Ms. Jenkins, you slapped a passenger. The fact that the passenger turned out to be the man who owned the entire airline is just the icing on the cake. No one will touch you. Not in this industry. Not ever." Within 6 months, her savings were gone. Her expensive apartment in a trendy part of New Jersey was a luxury she could no longer afford. She was forced to sell her car and move into a cramped, depressing room she rented from a stranger. The entitlement that had been her armor for so long was stripped away, leaving her exposed and terrified. She tried to find work in commercial aviation, applying to be a flight attendant for major airlines. But the background checks were thorough. An employment gap and a termination for cause from a high-profile charter service combined with the informal blacklist made her radioactive. Rejection after rejection followed. The woman who once judged men by the vintage of their champagne was now counting coins to buy groceries. The woman who scoffed at a Zegna tracksuit now wore cheap second-hand clothes. She was haunted by the memory of Julian Vance's calm, cold eyes. She had poked a bear, not realizing it was a god. Her rage, her prejudice had cost her everything. Her karma wasn't a single event. It was a slow, grinding descent into the very irrelevance she had tried to impose on him. She had flown in the gilded cage for so long she had forgotten she didn't own the keys. Now she was locked out forever, forced to watch the contrails of jets slice across the sky, a bitter reminder of the world she had lost. A stone tossed into a still pond creates ripples that travel to the farthest shores. The slap-on flight N700JV was a boulder heaved from a great height. Its impact did not end when the jet landed in Salt Lake City. The shockwave radiated outwards, reshaping careers, fortunes, and futures with the inexorable force of consequence. The karma was not a single thunderclap of retribution. It was a long, grinding storm that settled over the lives of those who chose silence in the face of ugliness. For Marcus Thorne, the ex-COO, the fall was precipitous and public. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the scaffolding of title and proximity to power. He retreated to his sprawling Connecticut home, initially confident that his track record and connections would land him on his feet. He was wrong. The story, in all its brutal detail, had preceded him. He found himself in the glass-walled boardroom of a rival tech firm, the final interview for a coveted Chief Strategy Officer role. He had been brilliant, charming the board with his market insights and aggressive growth plans. Then came the moment he now dreaded, the moment that haunted his sleep. A silver-haired board member, a man named Caldwell, leaned forward, folding his hands on the polished mahogany. "Marcus, this has all been very impressive." Caldwell began, his voice smooth as silk. "But we have to ask, your departure from Vance Innovations was abrupt. The story we heard is that the entire executive team was let go on the same day. In mid-air, no less. That's more than unusual. Can you walk us through that?" The air in the room grew thin. Marcus felt a familiar, cold sweat prickle his neck. He launched into the carefully rehearsed narrative, a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak, about strategic realignment and a mutual decision to pursue divergent paths. Caldwell listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When Marcus finished his rambling, empty explanation, the board member offered a thin, knowing smile. "I see. So it had nothing to do with a flight attendant, a physical altercation, and a test of character from your CEO." The directness of the question struck Marcus like a physical blow. He was exposed. The situation was complex. He stammered, his composure crumbling. "I acted in what I thought was the best interest of de-escalating." De-escalating Caldwell interrupted his voice, losing its silken edge. "Or appeasing Marcus. We're not looking for a strategist who runs from a fire. We're looking for one who runs towards it. Thank you for your time." As he walked out of the building, the familiar shame burned in his gut. It wasn't Julian he was angry at anymore. It was the weak, terrified man in his own reflection. He eventually found work, but it was a bitter pill. He became a senior vice president of a regional data analytics firm in a bland office park, his career trajectory not just flattened, but shattered. His new boss was a man half his age and a tenth of his intellect. Every day was a reminder of his own cowardice, a life sentence of mediocrity for a crime that took only minutes to commit. Eleanor Finch, the meticulous CFO, found her prison to be quieter, but no less confining. Her brilliance with numbers had always been her shield, a way to impose order on a chaotic world. But she had learned too late that some numbers don't add up on a spreadsheet. The variable she had failed to calculate was courage. She landed a job as vice president of finance at a respectable, if unexciting, manufacturing company. The work was beneath her, a series of predictable tasks she could do in her sleep. One afternoon, while walking past a break room, she overheard two junior accountants talking. "Did you ever read that article about Vance Aviation?" one asked. "The CEO fired his whole C-suite for just sitting there while a flight attendant went nuts on him." "Can you imagine just sitting there? Total cowards," the other replied with a laugh. "I'd have decked her myself." "What kind of leader lets that happen to their boss?" Eleanor froze her hand, clutching the strap of her handbag. They had no idea she was one of them. A coward. She fled to the sterile quiet of her office, her heart pounding. She looked at her desk, at the neat stacks of paper and the perfectly organized files, and saw it all as a monument to her own timidity. She had managed risk her entire life, avoiding every potential pitfall, only to fail the one test that truly mattered. Her prudence had become a pathology. The shame was a low-grade fever that never broke, a constant reminder that in the defining moment of her professional life, she had chosen to be a number cruncher instead of a human being. David Chen, the boy genius CTO, discovered that isolation was a choice, not a circumstance. He had always believed his talent was all that mattered. He was the architect of the digital world. The messy human interactions were for others to handle. The firing was a system crash he couldn't debug. He tried freelancing, his technical skills still in high demand, but projects required collaboration. On a Zoom call with a promising startup, he laid out a brilliant architecture for their platform. The young CEO was impressed. "This is incredible, David," the CEO said. "Really next level. Tell me a bit about your time at Vance." how did you manage your team during high-pressure integrations? David's answer was all technical jargon. The CEO pressed again. No, I mean the people. How did you foster teamwork? How did you handle conflict? David had no answer. The silence stretched. The contract never materialized. He was a brilliant mind in a vacuum. His noise-cancelling headphones, once a tool for focus, had become the symbol of his failure. He was alone, adrift in a digital sea of his own, making a ghost in the machine who had forgotten that machines are built by and for people. While their individual worlds crumbled, the world they left behind was being forged into something new and powerful. Julian Vance's overhaul of Sterling Sky Charters was ruthless and total. He arrived at their headquarters the following week and fired CEO Robert Sterling in a meeting that lasted less than 5 minutes. Sterling's pleas about one bad apple were met with a cold stare. Brenda wasn't a bad apple. Robert Julian had said, his voice quiet. She was a symptom of the disease, a culture of entitlement you let fester. The disease stops today. He promoted Captain Miller to Chief of Flight Operations. Miller, a man of quiet integrity, became the face of the new era. He personally oversaw the implementation of the character is our co-pilot program. It was an intense, mandatory training that involved realistic, simulated scenarios on de-escalation, unconscious bias, and cultural sensitivity. Veteran pilots who grumbled that it was HR nonsense were given a simple choice: adapt or leave. Many left. Julian replaced them with pilots and crew from all backgrounds, hired not just for their skills, but for their demonstrated character. Vance Aviation became the gold standard, not just for luxury, but for respect. The ripples of that day had washed away the rot, leaving behind a stronger, more resilient foundation. The fates of Marcus Eleanor and David became a cautionary tale, whispered in boardrooms, a stark lesson that in the modern world, the highest price you can pay is for the silence you keep. 5 years, a half-decade. In the blink of an eye, for a star an eternity, for a stone falling into an abyss. For Julian Vance, those 5 years had been a masterclass in ascent. Vance Innovations was no longer just a tech behemoth. It was a cultural and economic force with divisions in AI, sustainable energy, and aerospace. His gambit with Sterling Sky Charters had paid off beyond his wildest projections. Rebranded as Vance Aviation, it had become the envy of the industry. He hadn't just changed the letterhead, he had performed a soul transplant on the company. The new culture was one of radical accountability and unimpeachable integrity. His new executive team, led by a sharp and discerning COO named Amina Sharma, were not sycophants. They were loyalists, bound not by fear, but by a shared ethos. They were the warriors he had sought, and together they had built an empire on a foundation of character. On a crisp, sun-drenched autumn afternoon, the private aviation terminal at Los Angeles International Airport was a cathedral of quiet efficiency. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off polished chrome, and floors so clean they reflected the azure sky. On the tarmac, a brand-new Bombardier Global 8000 sat like a sculpted jewel, its sleek lines and pearlescent white finish a declaration of supremacy. It was Julian's new flagship, Vance Aviation 1. Inside the terminal, almost invisible against the backdrop of immense wealth, a cleaning crew moved in practiced silent patterns. Among them was a woman whose movements were stiff, her body stooped with a weariness that went far beyond the day's labor. Her grey uniform was clean, but ill-fitting her face, a roadmap of hard years. The hands that once presented crystal flutes of champagne were now raw and calloused from pushing a mop and wringing out rags. This was Brenda Jenkins. Her life was now a loop of monotonous tasks, punctuated by the roar of engines from the world she had been violently ejected from. Each day she cleaned the spaces where people like her former self existed. She wiped down the leather seats where deals were made, cleaned the restrooms with their gold-plated fixtures, and mopped the floors where men and women with effortless power strode. The irony was a constant bitter taste in her mouth. She had learned the sounds of different jets, not as a professional, but as a prisoner, listening to the sounds of freedom outside her cell. She was mopping near the large windows overlooking the tarmac when a motorcade of silent black electric sedans pulled up. She didn't look up at first. It was all the same to her. But then she heard a voice from the arriving party that sliced through the fog of her resignation. It was a calm, baritone voice, familiar and resonant. Her hands froze on the handle of her mop. Slowly, like a rusted hinge, she straightened her aching back and looked. There he was, Julian Vance. He hadn't aged. If anything, the 5 years had burnished him, stripping away any remaining softness and leaving behind the pure, confident charisma of a man entirely comfortable with his place in the universe. He was dressed in a tailored navy blue tracksuit, a nod to the very outfit she had once scorned. He was flanked by his team. A woman with intelligent, watchful eyes, Amina Sharma, was speaking to him, pointing at a tablet. The initial proposal from the EU Commission is weak on carbon offsetting, Julian. Amina said, her tone respectful but direct. They're trying to placate the legacy carriers. I think we push back. Hard. Julian nodded, listening intently. I agree. Draft a counter-proposal. More aggressive targets. Show them we're leading, not following. Let them catch up to us. Brenda watched this interaction from behind the glass, a pain that felt as thick and impenetrable as a vault door. She saw in that simple exchange everything she and her former colleagues had lacked: trust, courage, a united front. Amina wasn't placating her boss. She was advising him, challenging him. And he wasn't dismissing her. He was empowering her. A wave of vertigo washed over Brenda. The past 5 years collapsed into a single searing moment of recognition. The countless rejections, the move to a cramped apartment in a dangerous neighborhood, the shame of asking her estranged sister for money, the slow death of her pride as she took the only job she could get this one. It all led back to him, to her, to the slap. In her darkest moments, she had entertained fantasies of this encounter. In one, she would be waiting tables at a fine restaurant, and he would be seated at her table. She would offer a tearful, heartfelt apology, and he, in his grace, would offer forgiveness, perhaps even help. In another, more bitter fantasy, she would see him on the news, his company faltering a taste of the failure she had endured. The reality was infinitely more cruel. He began walking toward the terminal entrance, intending to cross through to another tarmac gate where his jet was waiting. He was laughing at something Amina said, his head tilted back slightly. He was powerful, happy, and ascending. And he was walking right toward the window, where she stood, frozen, a statue of regret, clad in a cleaner's uniform. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. He would see her. He would have to see her. The recognition, the shock, the flicker of memory, it would be a final, terrible connection between their two worlds. He drew closer. 10 feet away. 5. He passed the window. His gaze was forward on his destination. He didn't turn his head. He didn't glance her way. He didn't see the woman with the mop, the ghost in the grey uniform with horrified eyes. Nothing. Not a flicker of recognition. Not a moment of hesitation. She was just part of the background. A smudge on the glass. An object, not a person. In the grand scheme of his life, she was so utterly insignificant that her presence didn't even register as a blip on his radar. He had likely not thought of her name or her face in years. He had solved the problem, jettisoned the dead weight, and moved on without a single glance in his rearview mirror. The final crushing weight of her karma settled upon her. It wasn't that he had destroyed her life. It was that in doing so, he had expended no effort and retained no memory of the event. Her life-altering cataclysm was a forgotten Tuesday for him. She had tried to render him powerless and invisible, and the universe in its perfect, terrifying symmetry had returned the favor in the most absolute way imaginable. She watched his back as he disappeared through the doors. A few moments later, the Bombardier Global 8000 began to taxi. The sheer power of its engines sent a vibration through the floor, a tremor that seemed to shake her very bones. Brenda stood motionless, tears she didn't know she had left to cry, streaming down her face, leaving clean tracks on her grimy cheeks. She watched the jet speed down the runway, a symbol of everything she had lost. It lifted into the air with an impossible grace, a silver spear climbing into the endless blue sky, carrying the man she had wronged to a future she could never imagine, leaving her chained to a past she could never escape. The jet vanished, and all that was left was the silent, empty terminal and the reflection in the glass of a forgotten woman holding a mop. The story of Brenda Jenkins and Julian Vance is a brutal lesson in modern karma. It shows that in a world of cameras, connectivity, and consequences, the old prejudices have no place to hide. Julian Vance didn't just fire a racist flight attendant. He surgically removed a cancer of cowardice from his own leadership team. He understood that true strength isn't just about what you can achieve, but what you refuse to tolerate. The silence of his team was as loud as Brenda's slap. This story is a reminder that your character is defined in the small moments, the decision to speak up or to look away. What do you think was Julian's decision to fire his entire team justified? Was Brenda's fate a fitting end to her story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of drama and justice. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload.